Welcome back to Chess Dog. I'm John, and today we have a game between Alireza Firouzja and Hans Niemann. Now, I have, for the most part, stayed away from the controversy surrounding Hans Niemann, and I intend to continue to do that, at least for the time being. But Hans Niemann actually can produce some interesting chess. I have a number of videos about him on this channel from before any of that controversy took place. And when I saw that this game had been played in the FTX Crypto Cup between two very young, talented players, both 19 years of age, Alireza Firouzja and Hans Niemann, I decided this was a good game to look at and analyze. And it's actually quite an interesting game. Firouzja was 2778 at the time this game was played. Hans Niemann was 2687. And again, this was at the FTX Crypto Cup. This is a rapid game, 15 minutes for each side with a 10-second increment. Let's jump right in. Alireza with the white pieces plays e4. Hans Niemann with black responds with e5. Knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5, the Spanish opening, and knight to f6. The Berlin defense is played by Hans Niemann. Firouzja wants to keep things interesting, so he avoids the Berlin endgame and plays the move d3. Bishop to c5 was played. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop. So the structure is being defined here. Hans Niemann has the two bishops, but white is often going to target this pawn on e5 with moves like knight d2, c4, maybe play b3, bishop to b2, and put as much pressure on that pawn as they possibly can. He begins with knight b to d2, initiating that maneuver. Hans Niemann plays bishop to e6, so if the knight lands on c4, he can immediately snatch it off. Again, the e5 pawn is poisoned, because after knight takes pawn, queen to d4 would threaten mate on f2 and the knight. So you cannot take the pawn yet. Castle, and now the pawn can be captured, so Hans Niemann defends it with queen to d6. King moves to h1. That frees this f-pawn at some point. Perhaps white could play knight to g5 and f4, but it removes the pin from the f2 pawn. h6, a3, a5, and b3, setting up this bishop to b2 idea to again pile pressure onto the e5 pawn. Castles, bishop to b2, and now knight to d7 is necessary to keep the e-pawn defended. Firouzja plays queen to e2. He could play knight to c4. That attacks the queen and the pawn and would force bishop takes c4, eliminating the two bishop edge that black has, but it would cripple white's pawn structure a little bit. This position is even, basically. But instead he plays the queen to e2, rook f to e8 to add indirectly to the defense of e5, rook f to d1, and a4. A bit safer move is f6, and that makes this bishop bite on granite, and he would need to reroute it. So f6 was a bit safer. A4 is an interesting move. It gains space, but makes black's queenside pawn structure a little fragile. b4, bishop to a7, and now knight to c4 with the idea, and forcing this bishop off the board. By the way, if you're getting value from this video, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell notification for future videos. So bishop takes knight, pawn takes. The rook is obviously attacking the queen at d6, so the queen moves out of the way to e6, and rook to d2 with the idea of doubling on the d file. Now he could play c5. It looks like it's blocking out this bishop at a7, but after b6, Hans Niemann would begin to fight back on that diagonal. So he doesn't play c5 yet. He plays rook to d2, f6 now, and now e5 is firmly defended. Now c5 is played, and b6 is required because he can't let this bishop stay blocked out by the c5 pawn. Just can't allow it. Rook a to d1, attacking the knight at d7, and you can begin to see Alireza is step by step getting a better position. He only has one really poorly placed piece, and that's the bishop at b2, and that can be rerouted fairly simply. The computer showed that the best move for black here is rook to e7, defending the knight laterally, so there are no pins on the d file, but instead Hans Niemann plays knight to f8, and this ends up being a little bit passive, and now Firouzja can basically put his pieces wherever he wants to, set them up for maximum attacking potential. Pawn takes, and here Hans Niemann takes with the bishop. That does give him breathing room for his bishop, but 1, 2, 3 pawn weaknesses on the queen side are what he gets in exchange for that. He could take with the pawn, but then after knight to h4, Firouzja has a really strong position. The rook can penetrate to d6, and that's not so good for black. So he takes with the bishop. The knight does go to h4 anyway. Now Hans Niemann plays c5, trying to liquidate that double pawn weakness. Firouzja does not want to take the pawn, because if he does, then they have matching pawn weaknesses. He definitely doesn't want to do that. So instead, he pushes past the pawn, keeping these pawn weaknesses for black. King to h7 was played. I guess the bishop could go to a5 and get some activity that way. King to h7, knight to f5. And we know in these e4, e5 structures, knight on f5 for white or f4 for black is a very well-placed piece. The queen can come into h5, and we see Firouzja building up a pretty strong attack here. Queen goes to f7 to keep white's queen out of h5, and now bishop to c1. We talked about how this e5 pawn was firmly defended, and this was the only bad piece. So now he's beginning to reroute it to aim at this h6 square. h5 was played. Another acceptable move would have been c4 to open up this bishop at b6. The idea behind h5 is he wants to play g6. If he plays g6 here, then the h6 pawn would fall. He could take with the knight. The king couldn't retake because of discovery. So h5, so he can kick the knight out. Rook to d5, g6. And here, Alireza decides to go into the breach. He goes all the way in. If he were to, say, play knight to g3, he would give up most of his advantage. But instead, he plays knight to h6. Now, the computers point out another very strong move is you can just play the bishop here. And pawn takes knight, and black is in huge trouble after bishop takes knight. There's no way to take the knight comfortably. If you take with the rook, then rook to d7 is just a pin of the queen. And if you take with the queen, then queen to h5 check, and the rook is coming in, and black is just totally lost. So bishop to h6 was another interesting way to handle that. But he plays knight to h6 instead, hitting the queen. Queen to g7. So how to get at black's king? This is like a positional puzzle. You've got aggressively posted pieces, but how do you get in? Well, Firouzja plays the move g4 to open up lines on the king's side. Knight to e6 is played by Hans Niemann. Maybe he can block the bishop at c1 by placing a knight at f4. Pawn takes. He can't retake the pawn. Queen takes h5 would be devastating. That would be game over. Instead, Hans Niemann plays knight to d4, hits the queen at e2, but after pawn takes pawn with check, so he doesn't have time to take the queen, queen takes g6, rook to d7 check, king h8, and queen to e3. And in this position, Hans Niemann resigned because knight f7 check combined with rook to g1 is decisive. In fact, computers show white actually has like a mate in 15 in this particular position. So a dominating positional performance by Alireza Firouzja. And even after going over this great game from Alireza, there's still some great chess from Alireza you haven't seen yet. And if you want to see that, be sure to check out this video right here. This is really Alireza Firouzja at his best.